Okay, poetry, so definitions of poetry, and we'll look at poems to sort of help us along the way because it's hard to define or describe what the hell this poetry thing even is without looking at some poems. We will read a vast variety of poetry from oldish to newish, right? The idea is to get an impression of a few major movements in the history of poetic writing, right? As well as an understanding of what's possible in this art form of language. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, right, poetry is language sung, chanted, spoken, or written according to some pattern of recurrence, that emphasizes the relationships between words on the basis of sound as well as sense. It's a more condensed medium than prose or everyday speech, often involving variations in syntax. The use of special words and phrases, also called poetic diction, and more elaborate use of figures of speech, principally metaphor and simile. This is that word that we've been using all semester, right? Looking for patterns. And poetry itself is all about patterns. It loves patterns of all kinds, right? So there's some pattern of recurrence, right? Things that keep happening again and again and again, and this might happen in the sounds, the letters being used, ideas. The length of the lines, the number of lines. There's so many different patterns we'll be observing, right? It emphasizes the relationship in sound as well as sense, right? And so the sound of the poem will matter a lot, just like the sound of a song, right? It matters so much. So the sound of the language comes to the front, and as well as sense. And what sense means here doesn't mean the physical senses or the five senses. It means the meaning, right? Poems, the idea is that it sounds good and it means something as well. So the sound and meaning are intertwined. Okay. This is a great word. It's a more condensed medium than prose, right? So remember in the past, we did an exercise where you took like everything that happened to you in the previous day, right? And you tried to write it all in 15 minutes. So you had to condense an entire day of doing things, right, into 15 minutes. And you wrote that in sentences, right? And that was a lot of condensing that you did. 24 hours into 15 minutes, right? And then if you read it, it would probably take 1 minute to read. So it was really 24 hours condensed into a minute, right? Now, poetry is going to do even more condensing. It'll take these giant ideas, right? Like in Walt Whitman's A Noiseless Patient Spider, the idea of a soul, right? This massively huge idea, and it's going to condense it into a tiny little thing called the poem, right? 10 lines, right? And so it's all about condensing, right? And variations in syntax just means, words will be moved around, and syntax, right? The word like grammar, word order, things like that. And I mentioned before the use of special words. And if you don't know a word, look it up. Okay. All right, but let's look at a poet's definition of poetry. So this is W.H. Auden. Every poem is rooted in imaginative awe. Poetry can do 101 things: delight, sadden, disturb, amuse, instruct. It may express every possible shade of emotion and describe every conceivable kind of event. But there is only one thing that all poetry must do. It must praise all it can for being and for happening. And it's true, some will just delight, right? Just a happy little thing that occurs, right? Some are sad, tragic, right? And might, just sort of wreck your heart, right? Momentarily. Some are disturbing, right? Some are very amusing, right? That'll just make you laugh, right? And then others have some kind of lesson that we can learn from within them. And so poetry can do all of these things. It's not, it doesn't have to be a certain kind of, way of using language. So it can do many more things as well. This last bit is very interesting. There's one thing Auden says that poetry must do, right? Must praise all it can for being and for happening. Right? And what's lovely about these poems and what poetry is just that it exists. Similar to other art forms, right? Like a painting on a wall. You don't go up to the painting and say, why? Why are you there? Why are you being a painting? Right? It's an art form. It's there to just be, right? And you can go up to the poem and read it. And when you do that, it exists and it happens, right? So the poems themselves, they just are there, right? And what I love, they happen, right? When we read them. All right. So this is a good question. I mean, what is poetry not? Right? When we're trying to define it, since Auden says it's so many things, what is it not? Right? We know it isn't essay writing. It isn't journalistic writing, like the news. It isn't scientific writing. It isn't a cooking recipe. It isn't a shopping list. Right? It isn't directions to build a bed frame. It isn't technical writing. It isn't your everyday text messages. It isn't prose. All right. And prose, the definition is a form of written discourse based on the sentence, right, and without stylized patterning of verse. And prose is the dominant form of printed discourse. Features such as the paragraph and sentence-based punctuation. Okay, prose is also more closely connected with the rhythms of everyday speech, though in general it's more tightly organized than speech, right? Like essay writing. Okay. Here we go. Here's another poem. This is a children's poem by Eleanor Farjeon. What is poetry? Who knows? Not a rose, but the scent of the rose. Not the sky, but the light in the sky. Not the fly, but the gleam of the fly. Not the sea, but the sound of the sea. Not myself, but what makes me. See, hear, and feel something that prose cannot. And what it is, who knows? A lovely little poem. And it brings in this idea that, whatever poetry is, it is really hard to just pinpoint. All right? Like Auden said, it's 100 things and one. I love this line here. It's not the sky, but the light in the sky. Because when you think about it, for example, the sky doesn't really exist, right? You look up there's clouds, there's atmosphere, and so on. But whatever the sky is, all it is light in the sky. Okay, so there's this truth within it. And poetry is trying to get at that, right? The word sky is just a convenient thing for whatever's up there, right? But what poetry is going to look for is the light, right? And I mean, when you see a cloud, you only recognize the cloud because of the light on the cloud, right? So it's the light. And what's nice too is poetry doesn't have to be about pretty things. Right? So they mention a fly, right? And a poem can be about a fly, right? But maybe if you've seen like some close-up photographs of a fly, they actually have a very beautiful green sort of sheen, right, to their bodies, right? So this gleam of the fly. So you can find poetry in anything. Okay, and then lastly, the not myself, but what makes me, right? So not just objectifying the world, and but looking at sort of the mystery like behind things is something that poetry would attempt to do. Okay. Now, here's a couple things. poetry is difficult to define, right? We can say, well, what does poetry do? What is it doing, right? We've talked about a few of these, right? It condenses any possible thought or feeling into words, but not many words. Right? It tends towards an economy of language, right? And this is a good phrase here, an economy of language. That means there's a high value in the words, right? And very few of them. Right? And that's where it gets sort of the value from, is this economy of language. Tons of meaning packed into very few words. So highly valuable, right? In the word choice. Okay. So this is what I love about it. It often makes the ordinary extraordinary. Right? And it makes the known world fresh once again. And we'll see that a lot of poems are just about everyday items, everyday things, right? So it makes the ordinary world, right? The same old shit, day in, day out, that kind of stuff, right? It creates it extraordinary again, right? Let's us look at the world as if we're looking at it for the first time again. We'll see some poets, they try to mythologize everything, right? The origin of everything, right? In the origin of your apartment, right? Just to see your apartment for the first time again, right? Make it fresh, right? See it in a new light. And then, of course, sometimes poetry just does something entirely different, right? And none of this applies. So each new generation, each new movement redefines this art of language, and poetry itself continues to escape from definition. All right, so hopefully in this class, of course, you've had lectures similar to this in the past, right? You've taken English classes in the past. They've talked about poetry. Hopefully in this class, we'll see it again in a new light, and you'll be like, I had no idea that was considered poetry. There are two main types, right? In every poem, you can put it in this box or the other box, right? So it's verse versus free verse. All right, these two types, verse and free verse. So when we use the word verse, right, I'm writing in verse, or she writes in verse, right? This is what we mean, that there are these technical requirements of rhythm and meter present, right? And it's almost always reserved for metrical compositions, all right? So this is a very traditional way of writing poems. And you might be familiar, right? Like a haiku, it's 5 syllables, and then 7 syllables, and then 5 syllables, right? Or iambic pentameter, it's 10 syllables long, right? Split up into these 5 different sections, that it rhymes at the end, and there's a rhyming scheme. Or music, right? Most popular songs, even today, are done in verse. They all rhyme at the end of a line, and so on. So there's always these rules, right? These rules to writing verse, and within the rules, the poet has a thought, right? But the rules come first, and then they kind of get their thought fits into it. And Ezra Pound writes this as water poured into a vase, all right? Or as water, the poet's thoughts are poured into an already made container. There are these rules in verse that you might think they constrain the poet, but really it's they're like rules to a game, right? You wouldn't want to play a game without rules, right? Basketball has a set of rules that allow you to play the game of basketball, right? And so it's that kind of thing applied to language. There's a set rules, and it allows the poet to play within a set of rules, right? And so there's actually an infinite way you can do it. But like a sonnet, for example, every sonnet is 14 lines long, and the last 2 lines represent something that every sonnet will do, right? So, and then you can write a million sonnets, right? After you know the rules. Okay, so that's verse, right? But many people don't want to write that way. Especially into the 20th century, almost all poetry started to do something different, right? And it was free verse, Okay, so free verse, it does not conform to any regular meter. Right, the lines can be long as they want or short. Right, the length of its lines is irregular. Right, and as its use of rhyme, if any. Right, so poems that just don't rhyme at all. Okay, and they could rhyme, they don't have to. Right, there's no rules. So there's first a thought. Right, the poet has a thought of what they want to do with language, and it creates its own form or rules. So each poem might have its own form or rules. And Ezra Pound says this kind of poetry is as a tree has a form, right? The poet's thoughts sort of branch and flow off one another in their own way, and the poem takes on its own special shape. Okay. So these are the two types of poems, the poetic forms. And when you write about a poem, you can identify one or the other. So let's look at a couple examples. Here's an example of verse at the top, Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. And so even just listening to it, you can hear it. Right? It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden lived there whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. Okay, that's just the first stanza of a poem, a great poem. All right, now here's an example of free verse, Believe, Believe by Bob Kaufman. Let the voices of dead poets ring louder in your ears than the screechings mouthed and mildewed editorials. Listen to the music of centuries rising above the mushroom time. Cool. And if you notice, right, this one also has, it's visually, you see the form, right? It's like one line and then an indented line, one line and an indented line. And they have very similar sort of the syllables per line. You can hear, it was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea. And this is what's called meter, right? It's almost like clockwork, right? That a maiden lived there whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. Right? Everything is metered out in perfect little sections, whereas in this one, they're not. It's, if we look at it, okay, it's 6 lines, but it's 2 sentences in a way. Like, let the voices of dead poets ring louder in your ears than the screechings mouthed in mildewed editorials, right? If it was written in a sentence, it's a perfectly grammatically correct sentence, right? And then it's just a command, listen to the music of centuries rising above the mushroom time, right? If it was written out in a sentence, it would look, kind of normal. It's just, there's something about the subject and the word choice, which is very unique and strange. And there's still rhythm. There's no rhyme at all in this one, right? But you still can hear with these line breaks. The word here is enjambment. The poet chooses where to cut the line out, right? Where to make a break in the line. So let the voices of dead poets, and there's a pause, right? Ring louder in your ears, pause, than the screechings mouthed in mildewed editorials. So this helps create a rhythm, right? Just by deciding when to break the line, okay? But it's definitely not well organized like verse. It's just kind of goes out. Cool. All right.